The morning of my grandson's christening, I drove 40 minutes to St. Michael's in my best suit, the navy one Margaret bought me for our 35th anniversary, and stood at the church entrance while my son looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, I don't think today's a good time." 200 people were filing past me into that church. Neighbors, old friends, people I'd known for decades, and my son, Dorian, was standing there with his arms crossed like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. I said, "What do you mean? It's not a good time. This is my grandson's christening." He lowered his voice. "Sylvia doesn't want any disruptions. She's been stressed about the whole thing. You know how she gets." I knew exactly how Sylvia got. I'd been watching her get that way for the past 4 years, ever since she married my son, and decided the Calloway family needed remodeling, starting with me. I looked past Dorian into the church. I could see my grandson, little Owen. No, wait, Marcus. I could see little Marcus in his godmother's arms in the white baptismal gown my late wife had sewn for Dorian himself 38 years ago. The same gown. My hands had pressed that fabric into a box and kept it in the cedar closet for 38 years, waiting for this exact moment. "The christening gown," I said. "I brought the christening gown." Dorian glanced at the bag in my hand and something moved across his face. Something I couldn't quite read. Not guilt exactly. More like a door closing. "Dad," he said quietly, "please, just go home. I'll call you after." He never called. "My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I was a structural engineer for 32 years, mostly bridges, the kind of work where if you make a mistake, people die. I retired at 63. My wife Margaret passed away from ovarian cancer 8 months after I retired, which made the timing of my retirement feel like a cruel joke the universe had been setting up for years. After Margaret died, Dorian was all I had. He's my only child. We were close, or I thought we were. Every Sunday dinner, every Thanksgiving. I flew out to Portland when he proposed to Sylvia at some restaurant I'd never heard of, and I shook her hand, and I meant it when I said yes, I was happy for them. I paid for the wedding. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm keeping score, I'm not the type, but because what happened later made it relevant. $8,000. The venue in Napa, the catering, the photographer who charged more per hour than I made in a week at the peak of my career. I paid for it because Dorian asked, and because I loved my son, and because Margaret would have wanted him to have a beautiful wedding. I also paid off his student loans the year before the wedding. About $32,000. Again, not keeping score. Sylvia came from money. Or at least her family liked to give that impression. Her father, Cliff, ran some kind of wealth management firm in San Francisco and had a particular way of talking to me at family gatherings, like he was translating his thoughts down to my level. I never said anything about it. Margaret always told me I picked my battles wisely. I thought of it more as choosing not to waste energy on people who'd already decided who I was. After Margaret died, I started noticing things shifting. The Sunday dinners happened less often. Then they stopped. Holiday plans started getting complicated. Sylvia's family needed them in San Francisco, or they were too tired to drive to Marin, or Marcus wasn't sleeping well, and they didn't want to disrupt his schedule. I understood. I kept understanding month after month, in that way where understanding starts to feel like swallowing something you weren't meant to swallow. I called Dorian every week. Sometimes he'd call back the same day. Sometimes it would be 4 or 5 days, and when he did call, there was always background noise. Sylvia's voice somewhere nearby, dishes, a television, and the conversation would be short. He sounded tired. Or maybe just somewhere else. I tried not to read into it. I told myself that's what happens when your kid has a family of his own. That's what you want for them. But then came the christening. Marcus was born 14 months ago. I drove to the hospital the night Sylvia went into labor and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours until Dorian came out, and I held my grandson for the first time. I cried. I'm not embarrassed to say it. He had Margaret's ears, that slight point at the top, and I just sat there in that hospital chair holding him and thinking Margaret should be here, and he should know her. I offered to help. I offered to come stay for a few weeks, to help with the cooking and the night shifts, to do whatever they needed. Sylvia said they'd let me know. They never let me know. I bought Marcus a savings bond, $20,000 set aside for college. I didn't make a production of it. I just handed Dorian the paperwork one afternoon when he stopped by to drop something off. He looked at it and said, "Thanks, Dad. That's really generous." Then he left. About a month before the christening, Dorian called and told me they were having Marcus baptized at St. Michael's, the parish where Dorian had been baptized himself, where Margaret and I had gone to Mass every Sunday for 22 years. He said the date, gave me the time, and said, "Of course you're invited, Dad. It's your grandson. Of course I'm invited." I drove 40 minutes in my best suit and stood at that door. I didn't make a scene. I want that on record. I stood there in the doorway of St. Michael's with the christening gown in my hands, and I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at my son, and I said, "Okay, Dorian," and I turned around and walked back to my car. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, long enough that I heard the organ start inside the church, long enough that I thought about the last 20 years of my life. The career, the marriage, the money, the Sunday dinners, the way Margaret and I had talked about grandchildren for years before Marcus existed, and I made a decision. I was not going to let this slide. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters to me. I wasn't angry in the way people expect from stories like this. I wasn't shaking. I didn't want revenge in some dramatic sense. What I felt, sitting in that parking lot while my grandson was being baptized without me, was something quieter and more serious. I felt like a man who'd been handed a structural report on his own life and found the load-bearing walls compromised. I needed to understand what had actually happened, and then I needed to act accordingly. I called my attorney that afternoon. His name is Peter Ochoa, and I've known him for 20 years. I told him about the christening. Then I told him some other things I'd been noticing for the past 18 months. Things I'd filed away as possibly unimportant, trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. 18 months earlier, Dorian had asked me to give him a limited power of attorney over my financial accounts. He said it was practical. I was getting older. He was worried about what would happen if something happened to me suddenly. He just wanted to be able to handle things if necessary. I trusted him. He was my son. I signed the documents. 2 months after that, I noticed an irregularity in one of my brokerage accounts. A withdrawal I didn't recognize. About $14,000. Moved to an account I didn't have on file. I called the brokerage, and they confirmed that the withdrawal had been authorized by someone with power of attorney. When I asked Dorian about it, he said it was a transfer he'd made on my behalf to cover some tax-related exposure, and that he'd explained it to me when we spoke. I didn't remember the conversation. He seemed certain it had happened. I let it go. 3 months after that, there was another irregularity. Smaller, about $6,000. Again authorized under the POA. Again, Dorian had an explanation. Some kind of administrative reallocation. Something about estate planning. Something that made sense in the moment, and then stopped making sense when I was alone at the kitchen table, at 11 at night, going over my statements. I kept a log. Every transaction I couldn't account for. Every explanation that didn't quite hold. By the time of the christening, that log had 7 entries totaling a little under $40,000. Peter was quiet for a moment after I finished talking. Then he said, "Frank, I need you to send me that log. Tonight. And I need you to listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you." I listened carefully. The first thing Peter told me was that I needed to revoke the power of attorney immediately. Not next week. Not after I'd talked to Dorian immediately. I did it the next morning. I walked into my bank and my brokerage firm, and I revoked it in person, got written confirmation, and had copies sent to Peter. The second thing Peter told me was that he was going to refer me to a forensic accountant named Audrey Marsh, who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. He said that word carefully, exactly. It told me this wasn't unusual. That was the worst part. Audrey spent 6 weeks going through my accounts. What she found was methodical and careful and devastating in the specific way that betrayal by someone who knows your finances is devastating, not a smash and grab, but a slow and precise extraction over time. 23 months, a total of $61,000, moved through a series of small transfers designed to look like routine administrative activity. Dorian, or someone using Dorian's POA access, had been siphoning money from my retirement accounts, my brokerage, and a savings account I'd kept separate since Margaret's death. Audrey flagged one other thing. 6 weeks before the christening, Someone had called my primary care physician's office using my name and Dorian's POA authorization to request copies of my medical records. They'd specifically asked about cognitive assessments, any documentation of memory issues, confusion, early dementia indicators. My doctor's office had declined to release records over the phone without a written request, so the call had gone nowhere. But the request was logged. When Peter told me about that call, I sat very still for a long moment. I thought about the christening, about being asked to leave, about the explanations for the missing money that I couldn't quite hold on to. And I understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has built things that cannot afford to fail, exactly what had been happening. If I had any documented cognitive decline, I was not a victim of financial exploitation. I was a confused old man who'd mismanaged his own accounts. And if I was a confused old man, my complaints carried no weight. And if my complaints carried no weight, $61,000 stayed where it had gone. I was not confused. I was being set up to appear that way. Peter said, "We have a few ways we can proceed." I said, "Tell me all of them." What followed was not fast. People who want dramatic courtroom scenes and confrontations in living rooms will be disappointed by what actually happened, because what actually happened was paperwork and phone calls, and 3 months of extremely careful, extremely boring, extremely important legal and financial work. First, we moved my remaining assets. I had a financial advisor, Carol Teng, who'd managed my retirement portfolio for 12 years, and I brought her and Peter together, and we restructured everything. I set up a revocable living trust, naming Peter as the successor trustee rather than Dorian. I transferred ownership of my house into the trust. I updated all my beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts, removing Dorian and designating instead a 529 account I opened for Marcus directly. Because whatever was happening between me and my son, Marcus was still my grandson, and what happened to him was not his fault. That last part was important to me. I didn't want Marcus to pay for his father's choices. Second, Peter sent Dorian a formal letter. Not an accusation, not yet. A letter notifying him that the power of attorney had been revoked, that certain transactions were under review by a forensic accountant, and that I was prepared to discuss the findings through legal counsel if he wished to respond. Dorian called me within an hour of receiving that letter. It was the fastest he'd called me back in 2 years. He started with the things I expected: hurt, offense. How could I do this? How could I go behind his back? He'd been trying to protect me. I was making a mistake. I was clearly more confused than he'd realized, and that was actually why he'd been worried about me, why he'd gotten the POA in the first place. I let him talk. Then I said, "Dorian, I'm going to stop you there. I have documentation, every transaction, the request to my physician's office, the accounts the transfers went into, all of it." I paused. "I'm not asking you to confess anything right now. I'm telling you that the conversation has changed." There was a very long silence. He said, "Dad, and then stopped. "I know," I said. I heard him breathing. I thought about the christening gown in the back seat of my car, still in its bag. I thought about Marcus in that gown that Margaret had sewn, being baptized in the church where Dorian had been baptized, and I thought about how much I had loved my son and how none of that love had protected me from this. "There's a way forward," I told him. "But it goes through Peter's office, not through this phone call. Have Sylvia's father call me if he wants to be involved. I want it on record." I hung up. What I did not do, and I want to be honest about this, was feel triumphant. There's a version of this story where the old man wins and everyone cheers, and the bad people get their comeuppance and everything is clean. That's not what it felt like. What it felt like was standing in a building I'd spent decades constructing and finding out the foundation had been compromised, and now I had to decide what to do with it. You don't build a new foundation by celebrating that the old one cracked. You just build. It took 4 more months to reach a settlement. Dorian agreed, through his attorney, to repay the $61,000 over a structured period. The forensic accountant's fees came out of the first installment. Sylvia's father was involved in the negotiations, as I'd expected. It turned out some of the money had moved through an account connected to Cliff's firm, which complicated things for him considerably. No criminal charges were filed. Peter advised me that the civil recovery was cleaner and faster, and that criminal proceedings would be long, painful, and would not give me back $1 faster. I agreed with his reasoning. Some people will disagree with that choice, and I understand why. But I'm 67 years old, and I did not want to spend 3 years in a courtroom watching my son's face across an aisle. During those 4 months, I heard from my daughter-in-law twice. Both times were through her attorney. She was not present at any of the settlement discussions. I heard from my son in a different way, about 6 weeks into the negotiations. I came home one evening to find his car in my driveway. He was sitting on the front steps. No Sylvia, just Dorian, in a jacket I recognized from years ago, looking like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. I stood on the path for a moment, looking at him. He said, "I don't expect you to let me in." I said, "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said, "I need you to know it wasn't entirely my idea. And I know that doesn't make it better. I know that's not. I know." I looked at him for a long time. He looked like a man carrying something too heavy for the distance he'd already walked. "Come inside," I said. We talked for 3 hours. Not about the money. Mostly. About Margaret. About the year after she died, which Dorian had spent watching me navigate a grief he didn't know how to approach, and a marriage he'd modeled himself against without realizing it. About Sylvia's father and the particular pressure that man applied to the people around him. About the slow way a person can get pulled in a direction they'd never have chosen at the starting point if they could see the whole road. I didn't forgive everything that night. I want to be honest about that too. Trust is a structural thing. You can repair it, but you have to do it right, and you have to account for what failed. But I let my son back into my house, and I made us coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, where I'd sat alone going over statements at 11 at night, and I told him what I needed, which was time and consistency, and to be present for Marcus. He said, "I can do that." We'll see. That's not pessimism, that's engineering. You don't declare a repaired bridge safe until you've watched it carry load over time. My grandson's first birthday was last month. I was there. I held him for an hour while he attempted, with extraordinary dedication, to pull my glasses off my face. He still has Margaret's ears. That slight point at the top, the kind of thing that makes you feel time differently, like it's looping back on itself, and you're holding something that belongs to both the past and the future at the same time. I didn't bring the christening gown to the party. I put it back in the cedar closet. Someday, if Marcus has children, I'll give it to him and tell him where it came from and let him decide what to do with it. It's his legacy, not mine to hold on to. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this began, something I used to tell younger engineers when they were starting out. I told them, the strongest structures aren't the ones that never fail. They're the ones designed to fail in the right direction, to give warning before they give way, to protect what matters most when they finally come apart. I spent 67 years building things designed to last. My career, my marriage, my family. Not all of it held, but I'm still standing, and my grandson is still my grandson, and the coffee's still hot, and that's enough to work with. That has to be enough to work with.